Good morning and welcome to this meeting of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. This is the annual session of the committee to discuss the BBC's annual report. We're delighted to have Lord Hall and Anne Bulford here to represent the BBC today. We're also pleased that we're holding this meeting here at Key House in Salford. This is the BBC's home in Salford Quays. This is the first time this annual evidence session with the BBC has been held here at Media City, and it's given the committee a great opportunity to see some of the work that is done here by the BBC and other broadcasters, and we're grateful for the BBC for facilitating the meeting being held in Salford here today. Before we start the evidence session proper, there's one piece of housekeeping. Obviously, as we're doing this select committee hearing remotely, we're using slightly different technology, so we have to remember to turn our mics on and off when we ask questions and answer questions. And also we have just a couple of declarations from members of the committee before we start the session. And can I start first with Paul Farrelly?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to make it clear that I'm currently pursuing several complaints against BBC Newsnight, but those complaints are not relevant and will have no effect on the questions that I ask.
Thank you. Julian Knight.
Yeah, I was a former BBC employee and a deferred member of the BBC pension scheme.
Giles, did you want to?
Yes, I'm in receipt occasionally of repeat fees from the BBC. My £3, 10 shillings a year.
Thank you very much. We'll start the evidence session proper now, and start off just with questions regarding the finances and the accounts. In the BBC's annual plan, you state that you're nearing the frontier of efficiency at the BBC, and yet there's a requirement to deliver a further £700 million worth of savings by 2021-22. How are you going to make those further savings without compromising the quality of the output?
Thank you for the question. The licence fee arrangement was done, for the last licence fee was done at a time when the public finances were under as much pressure as they are now. And I think what's happened since then is we are in a very different media market to the one we were back then. The arrangement with government was a cash flat licence fee. To remind you, we had a licence fee going up with CPI. We abolished the levy for broadband. We also extended the licence fee, or the government extended the licence fee to cover non-linear broadcasting. All those things are really, really good. We also agreed to take on the burden of the over 75s from June of 2020. If you look at the quantum of the licence fee, then effectively the licence fee has been cash flat since 2010, which means that in real terms it's gone down by 18%. We've done a lot, which I really hope the annual report and accounts shows, to make that money go much further. In the last charter period, we took out £1.6 billion of savings every year. As the annual report and accounts makes clear, so far in this charter, totalling it all up, we've got to 277 million, but we have to make a total of 800 million to live within our means by the end of the charter period. At the same time, I think two things have been happening. One is that inflation in certain key genres, sport, but also in drama and also in some factual areas, inflation has gone up by much, much more than you could have predicted 2 or 3 years ago. And I think the second thing which has happened is that the audience expectations of what they expect out of a broadcaster, due to Netflix and Amazon and all the very good things they are doing for consumers, has also, as it were, increased expectations on the BBC. So I think we are at something of a turning point where we will need to be considering very, very carefully how we make ends meet over the coming years and what that means for the services that we operate. We're not at that point yet, but it's coming.
By saying that you believe the BBC is approaching a turning point, does that mean that it will no longer be possible just to try and make incremental savings across the board but still deliver the same sort of BBC we would recognise today, and that there may need to be more substantial decisions on genres or programming or channels and stations?
I think the record on savings, which we've managed to achieve both before my time and also in the period that Anne and I have been running the organisation, has been remarkable. That's a lot of hard work by lots of different members of staff, all contributing and thinking. We're targeting 4% savings per annum over the length of the licence fee. But yes, I think what you see now is I hate the phrase low-hanging fruit, and I'm about to use it, but the easier savings that have been made, really. And I think it's getting harder for people to see the savings, and we're having to talk about changes in the nature of the services we offer, as well as looking, of course, for savings that technology and other things can generate. But it's getting harder, yes.
Do you think that will include reductions in spending on originated content for channels like BBC One and Two and BBC Four?
Those are things that we're looking at. An independent report by Mediatik looked at the amount of money being spent on UK content over the next, I think, to 2026, and said that they can see a reduction in the amount of money spent on UK content by about £500 million by that time. Now, that's despite the money which Netflix and Amazon and Apple and others are spending on content in this country. Now, I think it was PAC that said, if you looked at the amount of money that is spent on UK content, roughly 2.1 billion, I think, a year was their figure, then 150 million of that comes from Netflix and Amazon. So the vitality, if I can put it that way, of the BBC, of ITV, of Channel 4, of Sky is really, really important to preserve and to grow what I think is remarkable in this country, which is a television production sector commitment, which I think is second to none. But I have long been worried about the future of that, especially when ITV is under pressure, we're under pressure, and others are under pressure too.
When Alex Mann gave evidence to the committee on the Channel 4 annual report, she raised concern that the days of the really big drama productions being funded by UK PSBs may, in the future, not be possible, and that the platforms like Netflix will simply price the PSBs out of that market. And notwithstanding the success the BBC continues to enjoy with drama, not least with The Bodyguard currently, do you share that concern that this is going to be a genre of programming which the BBC cannot be the big player it used to be?
I do, but to be honest with you, I think that's also an opportunity for us. I think Alex is right about that. But if you look at what we're told, The Crown, which is I've enjoyed, and it's excellent, $100 million or pounds, I'm not sure which, for 20 episodes. Then for that, we're producing many, many series of dramas, I think 13 different series of dramas, and reaching over 75% of the UK population. So I think what we've got to do is to see, okay, so there are these big, I kind of call them gas giants in the solar system. We're a small planet, relative, and these gas giants are out there. They've got things to do. They provide a great service for people. I love using them. But what we've got to do is to focus down on what we can do best. And I think Amazon and Netflix will not do Three Girls, which was a remarkable series we stripped over BBC One last year, and which led to the proper recognition of someone who had brought abuse to the public mind. I don't think. I think Jed Mercurio and Bodyguard is something which kind of, again, with our relationship with him, we can build on. I'm delighted to say Line of Duty is coming back for 2 more series. So I think we've got to kind of focus down on what we really do well, which is UK content, dramas about big UK issues, finding new talent or giving existing talent its voice to do things they might not otherwise do. And that's why I kind of, although you look with awe at the money on the West Coast, I also think it's a big chance for us to do something. And I make one other point, Chairman, which is if something is behind a subscription or paywall, it's less easy to bring everyone together to talk about it. And what's been amazing about Jed's work on Bodyguard is as you go around the place, people say, don't tell me what happened last night, I haven't watched it yet. And that sort of sense that we're all together talking about something which brings us together. It could be that, it could be something in the news, it could be the One Love Manchester concert. I think as social media, platforms behind paywalls create more divisions, I think we need to be focusing on things which also bring us together in ways that matter to the country.
Thank you for that. I've just got a couple more questions on I suppose, income rather than expenditure, just on the licence fee. Obviously, the BBC had estimated that the costs associated with funding the free licence fee for the over 75s would reach £725 million by 2020-2021 accounting year. Is that still your expectation, or do you feel that figure may grow?
That's the right range, but I think we think that figure will grow because the profile of the population, and then there's also the CPI effect as that comes through. But yes, that's a minimum number, and it will be higher. And
the BBC previously estimated that the revenue gain from closing the iPlayer loophole on mobile devices would bring in about £12 million a year. Has that been realised?
Yes, that's been realised. That's probably right.
So, one or two colleagues like to come in on this subject on the over 75s, but is this proposition sustainable for the BBC to fund this, or will you be seeking to maybe reduce that commitment by encouraging people not to claim their free licence, or by seeking some other form of compensation?
Yeah, the concession as it's currently formulated comes to an end in June 2020. That was part of the last licence fee settlement, that the policy would come to us from then. The board, the board, have got to decide what should replace it, because it comes to an end in June 2020. I think we've got to be mindful of at least two things. One is that we know that those over 65, over 75 consume many, many more BBC services than others. That's really good. I think we are lots of people's companion. That's great. On the other hand, there is real hardship among some or many of those over 75 too. So how the board comes to a decision about what follows the concession is going to be a process where we have to, because of the Charter Agreement, consult, and we will consult with the public. We're not at the position of knowing how we will consult and on what we'll consult at the moment, but that's something the board will be discussing over the autumn and winter.
Just final follow-up from me on that. So, but could you say, though, that the current concession on over 75's licence fees, as we know it today, will not be delivered into the 2020s? It'll be replaced by something which is different. To be absolutely truthful with you, it could be the same. The board could say we'll just continue with it as it is. It could be reformed. There's a whole load of options, and we're just not at the position at the moment to say, in all honesty, what the right option would be. And anyway, we've got to have a proper public consultation about all of that and what we do. And I think that's something the board is very mindful of, and will make a decision about at some point in the autumn and winter. As Director General, wouldn't you rather be spending some of that £725 million on content? Well, as Director General, of course, I'm thinking all the time about the money for what really matters, which is our creativity. And Chairman, what matters to our audiences are our programmes, which is why I'm very glad, by the way, that we've got the overhead rate, as is clear in the annual report, down to 6%, which is, is saying that the rest is going on programmes or getting programmes to the market. But this is such a difficult balance between, on the one hand, what can people afford, and on the other hand, our need to give people proper services, given the inflation that we're in and given the change in what audiences expect of us. But it'd be fair to say, from what you said this morning, you can't guarantee that the concession for free licence fees for the over 75s won't continue.
It could continue exactly as it is. We could change it, and I don't know what the board will decide yet. And that's something which is absolutely part of our work this autumn and into the winter.
Yeah. But there's no guarantee it will continue in its current form.
It could continue. I'm so sorry. I can't give you a guarantee it will continue. I can't guarantee what the board will decide, to be honest with you. That's for the board. And as I'm trying to I hope, say, this is quite a weighty decision because, as you said, Chairman, we've got, on the one hand, inflation in the content market. On the one hand, our audience is expecting us to do different things, and their expectations have gone up. On the other hand, real hardship among pensioners. This is a very, very difficult issue, and I suspect, it's one of the reasons why we have to think about it, and the government said over to you, is because it's a very, very hard thing to work through, and I know the board will take that very, very seriously.
Ian Lucas.
I think part of the reason why it's such a difficult decision is because it's essentially a political decision. But my slight sympathy for you is mitigated by the fact that you agreed to it as part of a deal. The chairman has touched on the timescale. Am I right in thinking that you will be consulting by the summer of next year on different proposals on this issue?
Mr. Lucas, well, thank you for the slight sympathy. I mean, we did agree to it because we thought we were.
You didn't have any choice.
Listen, I mean, I've said it to you all before. I'll say it to you again. That is no way to set a licence fee settlement done in a week like that. And thank you for your wholehearted support in saying that you don't think that's right either. But no, we'll have to have a consultation. It will need to happen reasonably shortly, and the board need to decide how that consultation takes place on the basis of what evidence we put forward to the public, and so on. You're completely right.
Giles, did you have a question on this subject?
Yes, a very quick question on drama production, and you mentioned Netflix, Amazon, the incredible production values that they produce, which is creating a challenge for you to raise the bar all the time, constantly. But the great thing about these, and please don't tell me I've only seen the first 2 episodes of Bodyguard, so please don't tell me what happens next. But those challenges that you have, I mean, if you overcome them and get it right, you have a vast global audience, and the sales of that must be incredible. So therefore, you can generate income there. So it's worth keeping up that challenge, worth keeping the pressure on, is it not?
I completely agree. We are making 2 series, for example, of Philip Pullman's Dark Materials. That's expensive because of all the computer-aided graphics that need to go through making the demons. I was on set with them in Wales, just outside Cardiff, 2 weeks ago. And I'm really pleased that we pulled off something there, which, the cost per episode is high. I mean, it's not in, I don't think it's in the Netflix, Amazon territory, but nonetheless, it's quite high. It's really, really ambitious. But I think all of us felt that was the sort of piece that the BBC should make. The nature of the book, the nature of who Philip Pullman is and all that. And we're showing ambition on that. On the other hand, Bodyguard is us, I think, having a really good relationship with an exceptional talent, and that's Jed Mercurio. I think there is so much that we can do by nurturing talent, as I say, finding new talent, giving voice, or as we did with King Lear, with Richard Eyre, which was kind of remarkable, saying to people who have done extraordinary things in their lives, do you know what, we can make something happen for you that other people won't fund. So however difficult it is, and it is difficult, and however constrained our finances might be, both working with our own and then with the right partners, I think we can do a lot. I think the issue is increasingly, as I think Channel 4 may have said in their evidence session to you, that whereas 2 or 3 years ago, you could sell a great deal to Netflix or you could sell a great deal to Amazon. I think the way that they're going now, and they are good people, we have good relationships with them, they are investing less in us as broadcasters, and we're going to have to go our own way with people who think like us. But I'm okay about that.
Yeah, I think that just to elaborate on that a bit, the co-production market internationally carries its own challenges, because the global SVOD players increasingly are seeking to launch on a global scale, and therefore they're looking for all rights in all territories, and the ability to carve out a first window for the UK as part of that global deal reduces as that strategy progresses through all territories, and we're starting to see some of that. So, and that of course is happening to other broadcasters in other territories. So getting together the finance requires a different set of relationships, and more work to go into that to pull that together. So it carries its challenges. It's not as straightforward as it might seem to get these big programmes financed.
One of my concerns, just finally, one of my great concerns is that because of cost pressures that happen year on year on year, is that the BBC might then become, if you like, risk averse. And if it does become risk averse, then we wouldn't have the wonderful history. For instance, Monty Python springs to mind as one of those great risks that was taken by the BBC many years ago and turned out to be one of the biggest earners. I would like to avoid that if possible.
I'm with you on that. I think it goes back to what sets us out from Netflix and Amazon and gives us, I think, a distinctive voice going forward, is us taking risks on ideas that might not fly on a global platform reaching 120 million people. But actually, we can take those risks. And I think, for example, Mother's Day, a very hard drama documentary, but drama about the events at Warrington is not something that I don't think is going to have global appeal or people are going to fund on that sort of level. We should be saying, we want to give the programme makers, the drama makers, an ability to make a programme like that, and so on and so forth. And I think we're very lucky. Piers Wenger and Charlotte Moore, the director of content, the director of drama, are absolutely aware of how we can strike that difference. And, it's good to see so many new dramas from us launching this autumn, saying we really take this seriously and we think we have an important voice here for the UK. So I kind of think, I'm sort of agreeing with you, I think our role will become more distinctive in that respect as time goes on.
One of the drama genres that's close to our heart is, of course, BBC Parliament. Will BBC Parliament remain as a broadcast channel?
Well, I think I very much hope so. I think it's a very distinctive service that we offer. I think it's really important that we find as many ways as we can, beyond BBC Parliament, though, to explain what is happening in Parliament and to make more people aware of what's going on. And I gave evidence to a Laws Committee on this a little while ago behind closed doors, but I think I take very seriously our duty to help voters to understand what is happening and what's going on, even beyond the Parliament channel. I think there's a big role for say, and I'm open to more ideas on how we can do that better.
I think it's right to say even obviously beyond the Parliament channel. Obviously, BBC News is analyses what happens in Parliament. But if you feel that it's important that the BBC explains what's happening in Parliament, do you think it's important that BBC Parliament should continue to have an edited daily programme looking back on what's happened that day in Parliament, and an edited weekly programme doing the same? These formats are produced obviously for radio, but do you feel they should continue on television and be available through BBC Parliament?
I do. I also think we should be looking at other ways in which we can attract people to what Parliament is doing. Could we, for example, and I was talking to the Laws Committee about this, could we, for example, work with the parliamentary website to allow people to search more easily by topic, to have notifications when things are being brought up in the House? Could we extend our service in that sort of way too? So that if you're particularly interested in, I don't know why I'm clutching at the A303, but say the A303, that every time that came up in Parliament, you were told it was about to come up, you could listen to it or watch it or follow up on something like that. I think it would. I would like a kind of group of like-minded people with the BBC to sit down and say, okay, how can we use this material and what you are doing and find news? This is beyond BBC Parliament, but find other ways too of communicating to the voters what you're doing.
I mean, it's been put to me that there is a plan that BBC Parliament will stop producing edited programmes and will just effectively broadcast live footage from the Lords and the Commons. But from what you said in your previous answer, it sounds like that is not the case. Could you just confirm that?
I want the edited programmes to continue. Let me just say, we are constantly reviewing what we do and looking, as Anne and I have been saying, we've got to make £800 million savings by the end of the Charter period. And we are doing well and well on the way. Therefore, we keep on looking at, should we be doing this, should we be doing that, could we do this better, could we do it more effectively? But don't read into that necessarily something that we intend to do.
And I mean, it was also put to me that not only was there concern over the future of the edited programmes of what's happened in Parliament being broadcast on the Parliament channel, but other programmes like Book Talk, which I declare an interest I've been interviewed on, the broadcasting of the Speaker's lecture series, other programmes like the repeats of election night programming that, for people that watch the BBC Parliament channel, are a regular part of and a feature of that channel. Are that genre programming going to continue as well, alongside the live broadcast of the footage in the House?
We are looking at how we can save money. I know there are some ideas about restricting some of the repeats of things that we do. But I'll happily write to you and give you more details of whatever we're planning in that regard. But, let me just go back to our commitment to getting people interested in and involved with and seeing what goes in Parliament is not diminished by any of these changes we might have to make there, but not in the Parliament channel itself.
Thank you. But you can confirm, though, that the Parliament channel won't become a digital-only service, or will remain as a broadcast channel as well?
We wanted to maintain as a broadcast digital service. There may be a time in the future when everything goes over to IP, when we want to migrate that to IP, but it's not in the next year or so.
In 2 years?
I really don't know. What we've learned from BBC Three changing into a service which is kind of almost on demand is you've got to do these things very gradually. You've got to pick your moment because you want the audiences to be able to consume you and find you there. But I can't see at the moment us turning off BBC Parliament as a linear channel.
I mean, the argument with BBC Three was that younger people watched television on mobile devices, therefore why not serve it to them in the way in which they consume it? Yeah. I'm guessing that the demographic for BBC Parliament is somewhat different from the BBC Three audience.
Yes, it is. My point about BBC Three, though, was what we've learnt from that, because I think it was the right thing to do, but with all things, you learn stuff, don't you? I think it's amazing what BBC Three has done. I think Damien Kavanagh has done an incredible job. It wins Channel of the Year and all that. But in retrospect, had we taken the transition to an online-only, on-demand, as it were, environment, maybe using a linear channel to make people aware of the new way that they consume BBC Three over a period of 2 years or so, that would have been better.
Just finally on BBC Parliament, the budget I think this year was £1.6 million, so it's a pretty small amount of money compared to what the BBC spends on everything else. I mean, how much greater level of contribution to savings do you think BBC Parliament needs to make?
This is this is a microcosm of the issues that we're facing. For BBC Parliament, read a local radio station. I mean, when I've visited nearly all the local radio stations, if 2 or 3 people are making a programme in the morning, it's quite difficult to say we'd like 4% out of that. And I think this is where I think we're having to think very, very hard, because running an organisation, you've always got to say we can do things better, we can do things more effectively, we can do things more efficiently. But there actually comes a point when dividing 4% into 2 people or taking something out is not the answer. That's a very good microcosm of some of the issues we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you. Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. I want to talk about and ask some questions about the changes you announced earlier in the summer to do with Sunday political programmes, and in particular the regional programmes, the regional part of that. Now, I know that we're getting a few more minutes, which is welcome, but where are we on whether things will be live or pre-recorded?
Our aim is to be live, but I need to come back with you. If you're asking me, can I tell you where each programme is, I can't. So maybe, Ms Elliott, I can come back to you on that, and forgive me for not knowing the answer. But the overall picture there was we felt very, very strongly that what we do regionally is phenomenally important. We don't want to lose that. What we do day by day, we wanted to kind of refresh, to think again about how we can, to pursue the line we've just been pursuing just now, get more people involved and to make it feel a bit like, I suppose, a bit like the Morning Joe in the States. But I mean, it's more informal, but also I think give people more analysis and background.
Well, perhaps I know a little bit more of what's going on in the regions. It's my understanding that they're still now suggesting that they only do 3 or 4 live programmes a year. We've had the nonsense in the North East, a classic example of where the pre-record because it's pre-recorded Friday tea time, which is a nightmare for MPs to get to. But we've had the nonsense, and this is an extreme example, but it just shows the problem of pre-recording on a Friday to be broadcast on a Sunday when an MP colleague died on a Saturday afternoon, and there had to be a statement at the beginning of the programme. And in the fast-moving 24-hour politics, particularly with Brexit, what is said on a Friday is a different universe from a Sunday. So I know that the proposal at the moment is looking like they're having 3 or 4 live programmes a year, which is just not acceptable. And I understand that weather is going to be done live. So there is going to be live bits put into a pre-record programme. And we've also got the nonsense that people who pay the licence fee in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland will be getting live programmes, but people in the regions won't. So can I urge you to look at this very seriously again, because it really isn't an acceptable level of service. It's not working. We've had the experiment since the last time, the announcements when it was changed to pre-record on a Friday, and it simply doesn't work. The programmes are not, however hard people try, are not as sharp. And as I say, with the way politics is moving at the minute, simply makes it not a worthwhile programme to watch in the way it would be if it was live. So that's where we are. So can I ask that is looked at again? Because I don't think cost in something as small in the global sum of the BBC budget is really an answer to that.
Look, thank you for raising that. And I think the editorial point you make, which is something happens, and, I think, it's very sad if somebody dies, but actually the nature of politics is such, I completely agree with you, what the world looks like on Friday is not what the world looks like on Sunday. Let me look at that. I think it's a really good point you've raised. And can I make another point as well? We've just appointed Helen Thomas, who used to be the head of programmes in Leeds, to be Director England. And I really think it was kind of implicit in what you're saying, but I may be getting it wrong. I want to make sure that we're serving the English regions as well as we are serving Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I think, that's really important. We put a lot of focus on Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. I want to make sure that England gets its fair whack as well. So thank you very much for raising that.
Thank you.
Paul Farrelly.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask a few questions about the Sir Cliff Richard case. How much did that cost the BBC in total?
Mr. Farrelly, I can't tell you yet. The process is not at an end, but might I say and repeat what I've said, in public in a variety of places. We really are very sorry for what Sir Cliff has been through, and I think there are 2 issues for us. One is the nature of the coverage, and then one is the principle that we were wanting to establish through carrying on with the court case, and I could expand on both or neither as you would like.
Well, just in what sense is it going on? You're disputing his claim for costs, are you?
that's going through the legal processes at the moment. We have an insurance policy which will cover most of those costs. But if I could just take you back, I think there are two issues at the heart here, which I'm sure you're thinking of too. One is the nature of the coverage. And my own view on that is, as Judge Mann said, this was a proper case, this was a proper thing to... we reported accurately what happened. But my own view is we overdid it. I think the helicopter was overdoing it. My own judgment, and judgment on hindsight is always a very fine thing, is it was something to report, but, you know, down the bulletin. You know, that's the first thing, the content. The second point, the principle we were fighting was that, as the judge said, we were reporting accurately. We felt that it was in the public interest for them to know that there'd been a police raid by South Yorkshire Police on Sir Cliff's property. But the judge took, rather than the Section 10, you know, freedom of expression, took the line which privacy was more important. And indeed, in the time since this case was covered by us, privacy by the judges has risen higher. And we felt that the principle of people knowing about this raid was more important in this case than the privacy, and privacy wasn't the case when we broadcast it. So we felt that was an important principle. But I took the view, once we lost the case, and I read the judge's judgment rather, very carefully a number of times and took advice on this, is that the case itself was not one I felt happy enough to go to appeal on, because of the way that I thought we overdid it, to be blunt with you. And I took advice from our counsel and from other counsel as well, who said that if we were to go ahead and appeal, we were very unlikely to win. It would cost licence fee payers money which I didn't think it was worth paying. And thirdly, it would prolong what Sir Cliff had been through, and I felt on those counts and other counts we should just not appeal. Which is why, just sorry, I do apologise, just to finish, which is why I felt very strongly this is an issue about reporting, which is, I don't think is for judges to decide, and certainly not for me, but I think it is one which Parliament should decide. I mean, you know, in the end, I feel very strongly this is something where you as MPs should say what is right for us as broadcasters and as editors and as journalists to report.
So why isn't it all done and dusted now? What are the issues still outstanding and of dispute?
So to date, BBC's paid damages to Sir Cliff as directed by the court and paid £850,000 on account of Sir Cliff Richard's costs. And the BBC's also paid £515,000 to South Yorkshire Police on account of their costs. There are follow-up hearings to deal with Sir Cliff's specific claims in relation to specific financial loss, and the contribution to the claim between the BBC and South Yorkshire Police needs to be resolved.
So what's it cost so far then?
Well, so far we've paid £143,500 in damages to Sir Cliff, £850,000 on account of Sir Cliff's costs, and £515,000 to South
getting
Yorkshire
on for
Police.
£1.5 million.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you've referred to some of the things you felt you got wrong. How much soul searching has there been in the BBC about actually this is not what the BBC does? We're not the Sun. We're not the News of the World. We're not the Mail or the Mail on Sunday. This is not what we do.
A lot of soul searching. I mean, I've always felt about the BBC's and its journalism that actually, despite what a lot of people think, these sort of issues are thought through very carefully, both before and then after the event. And I think this has been something we've been talking about, discussing what's proper a great deal. Might you know, we approached Sir Cliff's lawyers, and indeed I approached Sir Cliff on a couple of occasions, suggesting could we sit down and try to sort this out without going to the court. But sadly, but I guess understandably, the legal view came back, which was we don't want to talk, and we are prepared to settle if you say you have acted illegally. But I don't think we acted illegally. It's a pity, because it would have been good to resolve it before the court, but that just was not possible. But one of the reasons we are not appealing is because I think that the nature of the coverage was over the top, and I've said that, and I repeat it, Mr. Fowley, to you again today.
I'm clearly with a story like that and a use of a helicopter and authorising it on any newspaper, the editor would be expected to be involved. Were you in any way involved in the editorial chain, or did the buck just stop with Fran Unsworth in terms of decision making?
I wasn't involved in the decision about the story. Fran absolutely was, and Fran has been very clear that the buck stops with her, and I think she's been very forthright about that. But, you know, in retrospect, I mean, it's interesting. We went before the Home Affairs Select Committee 2 or 3 months after that, who thought the coverage was appropriate. They were rather critical of South Yorkshire Police. I think, you know, our considered judgment on this is, as I said to you, that it's a story which is runnable, but somewhere down the bulletin and not at the top. And I think the issue for us, as it were, the policy issue for us is it, at what point does the balance between the freedom to know and information outweigh the individual's right to privacy? And that is very complex, because you don't want a point at which people's houses are being raided and no one knows about it. On the other hand, I also have huge sympathy for somebody whose apartment has been raided, and then the charges X months later, or the charges are dropped. And as I think, as Judge Mann said, the problem in that case is, you know, things stick in people's public's mind. But this is why I wrote to government to say, is there a way in which Parliament can look at that? Because I think it is absolutely Parliament that should be deciding what is right in this very difficult issue of principles.
Do you think, as Editor-in-Chief, you should have been involved in the decision-making? Did you at any point in the aftermath think to yourself or say to anyone, why didn't you come to me?
It was in the middle of the summer. I was actually out of the country at the time, and had I been around, then most certainly I'd have said it should have come to me, but I was away and out of the country, so I didn't pursue that.
Okay, I didn't want to take up too much time, but I mean, clearly Sir Cliff took legal action. At any stage since the legal action, or after the controversy surrounding the story, did you internally examine how the BBC conducted itself vis-à-vis its own editorial guidelines, and did you identify any breaches?
We didn't identify any breaches. As I said to you, the Judge Mann was very, very clear that what we broadcast was accurate.
Okay, but did you conduct an internal review set against your own guidelines?
We have talked. We haven't had a formal review, but we have talked, as you can imagine, Mr. Fowley, endlessly at every level in the BBC about what we've learnt from this. And I think what we've learnt from this is about the nature of these stories and how we cover them, and the judgment we make about what is a BBC story and what is appropriate for the BBC to cover. I'm not saying it's not appropriate for us to cover this. I'm saying that its prominence, the scale of it, is something we've talked about very carefully. Would
it not be a good bit of housekeeping to measure the story against your guidelines, particularly if you feel that you need the guidelines need to be updated? I think the last time I looked at them, the introduction was by Sir Michael Lyons, who left the organisation in 2011.
You're preempting something, Mr. Fowley, which is that we'll be publishing a new edition of the guidelines, updated by this board sometime later on in the autumn. And as ever with the guidelines, we're trying not to make them expand, but we are trying to make sure that they cover all the things that we've learned since Sir Michael Lyons gave his intro to those guidelines some time ago. So yes, one of the things which I think is really good about the BBC is the guidelines, and the fact the guidelines are the summation of the thinking that goes on in news, in editorial policy, and more broadly across the BBC about what we think is right and what we think is right for the nature of our journalism. And that's something which is not only there in the guidelines, but is something the board actually takes very seriously too, because it is, number one of our public purposes is information, as you know.
Okay, my last question before moving on. Not now, it'll take too much time, but after the session, could you write to us to spell out what you're asking the government to do in terms of the law, and also spell out to us which parts of the judge's ruling you feel compromise potentially the freedom of the press to report on investigations before anybody is charged? If you could write to us, that would be very helpful, I think.
I'd be very happy to do that, and I can also copy you the letter I sent to the government on exactly this subject, but I'd be very happy, Mr. Crowley. Thank you.
Thank you.
Julian Knight.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I have to say, as a licence fee payer, I do find it quite incredible that after £1.5 million being spent on a legal case, and also the cost of the helicopter, amongst other things, there was no internal review taken place within the BBC over actually what went on, and whether or not editorial guidelines were broken, whether or not those editorial guidelines were old or in process. Now, this is obviously the most high-profile case the BBC has been found wanting in, but also recently there was an Ofcom ruling over Medway and the Medway Young Offenders Institution, a Panorama investigation, where it's shown that there was a serious breach because you brought a programme forward effectively to protect an exclusive, and as a result, a vulnerable teenager was identified during effectively the programme, which they shouldn't have been. This sort of feeds into what I've heard your question with Paul, actually. Editorial, has the BBC got a serious problem here, in that when it tries to ape the tabloids or becomes obsessed with being first, effectively, that is where you fall down. And what are you going to ensure that the BBC may not be the first to breaking news, but is correct? Because expressions of regret afterwards, frankly, aren't good enough.
That's a really interesting question or point that you're making. I think the BBC's journalism must stand apart from others. I go back to our public purposes. It's number one, and it's number one for me. I think impartiality matters hugely. I also think us having the guts, braveness to tackle subjects that others don't tackle is really important too. To carry out investigations without fear of favour is really, really important. And I think the fact that we are transparent in a way that I don't think any other organisation is in the quantum of our editorial guidelines and how we therefore hold ourselves to account is really, really important. I mean, we do put our hand up if things are wrong. We do say if we think there's an issue here that we want to discuss a lot more and have a public debate about it. And let me just say, I said very carefully, there was no formal inquiry into Sir Cliff Richard, but believe me, the number of times we have discussed the implications of this in editorial meetings and with editorial policy colleagues, and as well with the then Director of News, James Harding, and the current Director of News, we've discussed this and discussed this and discussed this. So it's not appointing somebody formally to look at it, but please don't for one moment think, Mr. Knight, that we haven't gone through these issues very carefully, because we really do.
But just returning to my actual question, what are you actually doing in order to ensure that the BBC is not about being first, but it's about being correct?
Well, number one, this is something which Fran Unsworth and I talk about a lot, and accuracy is extremely important. Implicit in your question is also the agenda. I think the agenda is really important for BBC News. And when I look at the News at 10 each evening, I think the agenda we're pursuing there is exactly right. I think the programme is in very fine shape. I think it's covering the world as well as this country well. We've just appointed Kamal Ahmed to come in and be an editorial director in the news operation, and his job will be to look at how we ensure that the agenda, that the time we spent on key issues are not just the issues of the moment, but also look at issues that are maybe below the surface that we're not tackling, that we use our news gathering force across the world to reflect the world back to this country, and also explain more what it is that is going on, so that our viewers and listeners can understand the complexity of the world that we're currently living in. I have great ambition for BBC News under Fran, and also with Kamal's help, for what we can do.
Okay, thank you. What's your analysis of how Ofcom regulation is going to date? What do you see the challenges, the positives and the improvements that need to be made as a result?
I think one of the successes that we don't really talk about has been the way in which we have a completely new system of governance, both in the BBC but also with Ofcom. And I think our relationship that we've developed with Ofcom in the first year and a half of Ofcom's complete overseeing of us has been really good. I mean, you know, they are there to regulate us. We are there to be regulated. And I think our relationship has been open. I think testing. I think Ofcom have asked us to deliver degrees of information which I think are proper. So far, so good. What do I think the issues are? I think they're probably twofold. I think there's always, in any regulated environment, how much regulation versus how much scope you need to run the business. Sharon White has always been very clear with me and clear in public that she's not running the BBC. She's regulating the BBC. But you know and I know that actually those marchlands, those boundaries, are difficult. I think the bigger picture for regulation in the UK is something which myself and other chief execs of broadcasters wrote an open letter on 2 or 3 weeks ago, which is we have a very highly regulated, properly regulated, you know, we're spending public money, but very good ecology of broadcasting in this country: BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5 and Sky. And then you have the dramatic change, which we all know about, in the market with the entrance of Netflix, Google and so on. Not regulated, or very lightly regulated. And what we as broadcasters were saying there was there must be some way of putting the things which we think matter in the broadcast or social media ecology to make all of us responsible, not just part of the market. And I think that big question, which is how you regulate what is at the moment unregulated relatively, and get the balance right between the highly regulated and the unregulated, matters. There are huge advantages. I mean, you know, Google and Netflix, Google we have a really, really strong and good relationship with, but we know some of the issues which, you know, you've been looking at and you've been dealing with. And I think finding a way of treating us all fairly properly for the ends that you as parliamentarians want is an issue for, well, actually it's for you, it's not for Ofcom in a way, it's for you almost to decide to say to Ofcom what is the right way forward.
Okay. Just finally, do you think the reality of Ofcom regulation is bedded down with BBC editorial and programme makers? And what more do you think needs to happen in that sense?
I think what's built up between ourselves and Ofcom is an understanding of our respective positions. I think if I was to say areas where we need to do more work, I suspect it's probably this, number one, which would be, we know, you know, that the world in which we're all operating is moving very, very fast. You know, what seemed the case a year ago is no longer the case. And I think the issue for a broadcaster like the BBC or an ITV or a Channel 4 is we've also got to move and change fast as well. So how regulation keeps up with the pace of change, I think, is a really big issue. Sharon's completely aware of that, and we talk about these things. We have a very open and good relationship about it, you know, respecting each other's different positions. But I think ensuring that regulation can allow and keep up with a rapidly changing marketplace where consumers, which is great for consumers, are getting different things, I think that's an issue.
So just fine. So you are confident, effectively, that the realities of Ofcom regulation has bedded down entirely with BBC editorial and programme makers, and they know they exist in the new ecosystem.
I'm sorry not to be more direct in my answer to you on that. Absolutely, yes. I think it has bedded down, and I'd say, Mr. Knight, that is one of the, I think, the successes we've managed to make that happen over the last 18 months, and that's much to Ofcom's credit as well as internal BBC. I mean, there are always going to be bumps and there are always going to be grinds, but I think we've got a good working relationship, a very good working relationship.
Thank you.
Ian, did you have a quick question on this?
Yeah. On the Cliff Richard case, how long before the police search took place was the BBC aware of it?
As I recall, Mr. Lucas, some weeks before we were tipped off about it.
And you were not advised of that at the time?
No, I wasn't.
And was any payment made by anyone from the BBC to any public servant concerning the information about that search?
No.
Thank you.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you. Changing the subject completely again. The last time that you both appeared in front of the Select Committee, we talked at length about equal pay. And I am delighted that in recent weeks there's been a settlement of the grievance with Carrie Gracie. But I'd like to know where the BBC are now with the outstanding cases on equal pay.
Sorry. Yes. I think, as we explained to you when we saw you before, we're undertaking a widespread reform across the whole of the BBC. Since we last gave evidence to the committee, we have successfully agreed with our trade unions and our staff our new framework. And we've published information to all our staff about where they sit including on-air groups, about where they sit in a market-informed pay range. So I think the first point I'd like to make is that people have, men and women across the BBC, have a huge amount of information now about what they're paid and how they sit relative to their peer group. The second thing is that we have, on a number of occasions, encouraged people to come forward and, if they've got questions, ask them in a very proactive way. And as a result of that, we've had a lot of people step forward and ask questions about their pay. Some of those are very straightforward. Can you please check that I'm in the right place? Others are very complex sets of circumstances which raise very serious equal pay questions that need to be addressed. So we have been putting a huge amount of resource into dealing with all of those queries. Our objective throughout has been to resolve as much as possible through an informal process, by which we mean not asking people to making people go through a formal grievance. But I want to be very clear that that informal process, it's actually extremely rigorous internal assured process involving the individual managers, HR, and where appropriate, legal advice on what we're dealing with. So we've been dealing with hundreds of questions. We've dealt with very many of them. We still have around 50 to 60 cases being worked on, and we have a number of cases which, despite all the work that we've done, people have chosen to take through to grievance and appeal. But there's a good process in place to resolve these as quickly as possible.
So are those 50 to 60 cases informal?
Yes,
cases?
we have at the moment. We have just over 200 cases that are in informal resolution stage. Of those, 70 or so, we've done the work. We're in conversations with people about what the result of that is. There's another group of cases which have gone through where people have chosen to take them onto the formal stage. And then we have 64 cases where we're still doing the detailed work and aren't ready to go back to people, some of which are quite recent cases. But they're just to reinforce, these are questions about what people are paid. They're not necessarily cases which would be represented as equal pay cases when we get through all of the work.
I mean, I do welcome the structure, which I think was one of the things that led you into this, not having a structure led you into this awful situation that you ended up in. But I understand that there was over 200 formal grievances lodged. How many of those are outstanding?
That isn't, those are not the figures that I have. We have had a total of 78 formal grievances lodged. Of those, 7 have been resolved, including being out of time to be on appeal. 3 are on hold because we're in discussion with individuals and hope to deal with them in a different way. 53 are being worked on. 4 are very close to very close to being completed, and 1 is in very detailed discussion. So right now there are 68 outstanding formal grievances.
And what is the timescale for those to be settled? Because this is an awful long time this is going on.
Yeah, I mean, around there are 13 of them which are over 90 days, which is outside of our target. The rest are within the time frame that we're working on. Some of these cases are very complex. They go back over a long period, and they involve looking for comparators and checking history of people that have named as comparators back through different parts of the BBC over a long period. So we all regret the time it takes. We would like them to move more quickly. It is a rigorous and thorough process, and it needs due time. The other thing that is in place with the formal grievance process is that there's an independent BBC hearing manager, by which I mean separate from the business area people work in. And then the second member of the panel is an independent appointment from the company Kroner. And in the event of the dispute between the two individuals on an outcome, the Kroner representative has a casting vote, which is as a mechanic that we put in place dealing actually some time ago with sexual harassment cases, so that our people can have confidence in the independence of that process. You know, that adds an additional level of assurance. I don't know whether that slows it down, but obviously you've got somebody independent who needs time to understand the roles, the jobs, the comparators, and that takes time as well.
So do you feel that the people involved who've lodged these grievances are satisfied that things are moving at the speed that they should be moving at, and that the staff resource has been put in to, bearing in mind what you're talking about is complex work and can't be just done in 5 minutes, being done at the speed that it should be being done at?
I think there are two things. I think firstly at the informal resolution stage, some people feel very strongly that we were not moving quickly enough, and indeed that's one of the reasons that some people have moved through to grievance, and those are people that we're very keen to try to deal, that we still keep the informal route open while that runs through. I think it's the case with the individuals involved, with the managers involved, with everybody working on it. We want these cases resolved as quickly as possible. We continually look at resource and whether putting more resource on can speed things up. And one of the things we're considering and hope to make a couple of points is to put some people on the hearing manager role full time. Because, of course, as people around the table will know, familiar with these processes, normally what you ask is a person of appropriate seniority and independence to deal with it alongside their day job. It's a big ask. And I think we feel we want to put more dedicated resource, particularly onto these very complex cases.
And how is staff morale, particularly amongst women who have been affected by this, and what are you putting in place to try and support and improve staff morale where there has clearly been a problem?
I think it's better. I think we feel that there's a more open discussion about the issues, and that people are more confident that they're pushing at an open door when they raise issues with us. It's not to say that we agree with everything people raise with us or they're comfortable with everything we say back to them. But I think a very important shift has been the work that our colleague Donalda McKinnon in Scotland led on the progression review. we've undertaken reviews in a number of areas for different groups, but the first that we published in relation to gender and then ethnicity followed on pretty quickly. And we have work running on disability, social inclusion and sexual orientation as well. But that work was, that project which Donalda led on was very, very important. I think the number was something like 5,000 separate individuals across the BBC contributed to that. And it raised some very important questions and some really good work on things that we can do to practically support women around the organisation, all people around the organisation, in terms of developing their careers. And I think and seizing opportunities for development where that works for them. And what was, I think, very interesting about the work is that it really, there are things that we could add in, but actually we have lots of schemes, lots of arrangements, lots of things, but these very deep kind of cultural issues around people's confidence to step forward and take those opportunities. A good example was in relation to part-time working. We have very many schemes for part-time working, job share arrangements, flexible working in place. And actually our gender pay gap in relation to part-time working is minimal. So, you know, all of that looks good. But we had very strong messages through from very many people in the organisation that there's a stigma attached to part-time working. And, you know, nothing could be further from the truth in what we're trying to achieve, but we've got a lot of work to do to encourage everybody to consider flexible working as a norm rather than as something special to be negotiated, and that because you want to work flexibly, that doesn't represent a badge of lack of ambition at all. It represents a point where in your life, or perhaps for longer, that you want to work in a different way. And so therefore, very simple things like looking at all jobs and beginning from why shouldn't this be flexible, as opposed to advertising them as a standard working arrangement, and then asking people to ask for them to be flexible, because what came through loud and clear is that deters people from applying in the first place, and that holds people back. And as everybody knows, even though the world is changing, many people have responsibilities outside work. These things still disproportionately impact women with children. So it's been, I think, a very important piece of work. Donalda put a huge amount of time into it, and she had great support from very many women across the organisation. And I think that's helped us a lot. Now, the important thing for us as a leadership team is going to be to demonstrate that having got these messages, we're now on it. Right. And so what we're doing as an executive team, with a lot of support from our non-executive board colleagues, is we're going to complete the other reviews, and then we're going to pull them together and look at an action plan. We decided, it was quite interesting, we had a sort of internal discussion whether we should complete them all and then talk about everything. But actually, for all the reviews, people have put such heart and commitment into giving us our feedback. We felt that each of the different reviews, the right thing, the respectful thing to do, was to report back to each of those groups specifically on the issues they'd raised with us.
So when, after all of that work's been done, and you are clearly doing a lot of work, when do you think the BBC will be in a position where things have been put in place where this can't happen again? Certainly on the scale, everybody can have an individual case happen, but when do you think you'll be in a position where you can confidently say that everything's been put in place, that this type of real problem with equal pay can't happen again?
I think that the structural weakness that in the frameworks for roles, we have pay and grading systems, those mechanics are in place, but the introduction of the career path framework, which we are a long way through implementing, it isn't completely finished, and it will be a living, breathing thing, and jobs will change and roles will change, and we'll need to keep looking at them. But I think we've made tremendous progress, and we feel much, much more confident about individuals' clarity about where they sit and why, and managers' ability to judge pay, and our ability to monitor that with these frameworks in place. And as at the moment, we're going through the first of our 6-month pay checks, which is giving all managers information to look at the cohorts of their people and look for adjustments that need to be made on an ongoing basis, and putting money aside to deal with that. Because all of these issues, of course, have come up in a period of pay restraint where there hasn't been that much money around beyond the annual inflation increase. And, you know, there's a lesson in that, because I think you have to recognise that everything can't stay the same for these long periods of time. And we've got that, and we're working on that. So it's not to say that we'll get everything right in every case, but the two things that we're seeking to do is we're seeking to answer these historic issues as quickly as possible in a proactive, open way. And it's not easy, and some people aren't going to be easily resolved, but we're doing our best with that. And at the same time, setting up the career path framework, the reforms to terms and conditions, which simplify contracts, simplify allowances across the whole of the BBC. Combination of those two things makes it much, much easier to judge pay, make appropriate comparisons, and minimise the risk of problems arising. And if they do, we'll continue to deal with them. Thank you.
Julian Knight.
Thank you, Chair. I actually spent yesterday evening speaking to some of your employees, and it was, I have to say, it was a very different sort of response I got from them in terms of the processes and in terms of their experience.
Yeah.
One that particularly struck me was a young lady. I'm going to use a false name in this case. Let's call her Karen. She believed that she was underpaid to the tune of £10,000 a year with a direct male counterpart.
Yes.
She put in a claim in the autumn, and after several months, she was told there was no claim to be had. She says then she was actively discouraged from putting in another claim, as in an appeal. When she actually decided to appeal, the tone of the conversation changed. Once again, this individual alleges intimidation from senior management, and the instituted a grievance which again ran into the sand, all the while this individual was warned that she'd be hearing from BBC lawyers. Eventually, the individual decides to leave the organisation she's worked at for decades. This is no fly-by-night individual. This is what is termed a BBC lifer. Hearing that, isn't there a sort of sense of shame this is still going on despite this committee bringing this to your organisation's attention? Where are you still going wrong?
Well, I'm afraid I'm very upset to hear if someone's had an experience like that. I'm not familiar with that case. Lawyers, of course, are involved in making judgments around equal pay claims. That's inevitable. But we have made, at a senior level, every effort to encourage people to put forward claims. There's no barrier to that. The numbers of people that have stepped forward makes that clear. I can't answer the question that you raised because I don't recognise the circumstances of that case. But what you describe is so far away from what we're trying to achieve that all I can do is understand the details of it and follow up on it.
I do actually believe that this is very far away from what you're trying to achieve. As long as I know that, and I know that with our previous sessions.
Common experience.
However, well, it's certainly experience that's been related to me, and that's not just one; it's several over a period of months. But what I would say is one of the issues is the whole thing the whole issue came about because of the way the BBC is structured. It's sort of fiefdoms, effectively, and how it is that people bring salaries from one job to another and carry it over, and no communication, operating in silos. Are you confident that what you have put in train here in terms of answering these grievances circumnavigates that problem that you have as an organisation? That effectively managers downstream are not, as this individual Karen states, following up a grievance with intimidation and bullying. How are you ensuring that isn't the case?
Well, the mechanics that we have in place allow people to raise grievances outside of, and informally or formally raise questions outside of their management line. It comes through a rigorous process through HR, with independent assurance running through it. Our colleague Peter Johnson, who's the director for Northern Ireland, has acted as an assurance point throughout. It's a mechanic that runs here. Acted as an assurance point that individuals can go to if they have concerns with. He's also independently reviewed the process for me again. All the cases come through an insurance process at divisional level, and they come to a management meeting which I or one of my senior colleagues chairs to look at each case, whether they are yeses or nos or
yes, but all you're seeing is the black and white there. How are you ensuring that the communication that's being had by the employee when they're coming in this moment to their boss, their direct line manager, how are you ensuring that that is actually not the wrong conversation that's going on?
Well, we're doing our best to support managers and individuals, and at all times, all individuals have a number of places that they can go to raise complaints about the way in which the process is running. There are a number of independent helplines through the BBC. There are a number of contacts. Individuals can come to me. They can come to Tony if they find they've got no other route to go to. We've repeatedly gone out and encouraged people to step forward, and if they're having experiences which are as you described, then there are opportunities for them to come through. At the same time as reinforcing down the management line that the only way to resolve this and to put this to rest is to deal with each case on its merits fairly and openly. And if there are examples of intimidation, as you described, it's not what we want, and I would like to put those right.
Yeah, and I can assure, and will you say today that any managers that are found intimidating and putting off BBC women from coming forward in this way, I effectively will face serious disciplinary action for so doing?
Of course.
Of course, absolutely. Right. Okay. Now, just to focus on your independent HR company, Krona. Of all the cases that Krona have actually sat in, how many have been resolved in the claimant's favour? And how often has Krona used its casting vote in favour of the claimant?
I'm not aware of that sort of issue coming through. The outcomes from the grievances, their individual cases, generally what they're finding is, and of them, a very small number have come through and been resolved. There's still many in progress. What they're broadly doing is investigating additional facts or additional context that's coming through. And there's a range of outcomes. I don't think we've had any which are a complete sort of overturn. At the informal resolution stage, we thought this. At the grievance stage, this conclusion's reached. What tends
so on
to
appeal,
happen,
no one wins on appeal?
It's not necessarily a question of win-lose. We're still in an informal process. We're trying to reach resolution with people.
But the individual is not going to
Sometimes
appeal
individuals goes to... What tends to happen is that there's more context, that there's a different range of financial recompense comes out, so perhaps the issue is judged to have gone back for a longer period, or other comparators come in, and potentially there's a higher increase going forward. Those sorts of things come out. But I don't think we've had one where at the informal stage we've thought there's no case, and then at the grievance and appeal stage there's been a case. It's about what is this, how long has it gone on for, have you taken all the right comparators into place, is there something more to come, more information comes out.
I understand this is a very complex issue. I understand this.
And
has
each
many
case
different
is very
strains,
different.
Very different, I understand that. But there does seem to be, frankly, in what you're saying, there does seem to be a lack of clarity in terms of, and disclosure, in terms of actually getting right to the heart of it and saying, OK, well, this is the number of cases resolved, this is the number of cases that actually have gone to a casting vote at appeal, this is what has happened in those cases. I'm just wondering whether or not down the line you will look at supplying that sort of information actually being put into the public domain so that people can be sure that effectively that when they do come to this sort of juncture that actually they're facing a process which is not meted in one direction rather than the other, that they actually can be confident that the appeals process does sometimes lead to something happening which didn't happen the first time around.
I hope that people do have confidence in the grievance and appeal process. They're going through. We've been very clear that we'll publish at effectively in the accounts of next year where we've reached, what we've gone through, how many cases we've dealt with, what stage they've reached. I want to be very clear that the Krona casting vote thing is in the event of a dispute. I'm not aware that there have been disputes in the cases that have been resolved.
Okay. Now, I understand that several claimants have submitted FOI requests. This is what happens basically when you deal with journalists. They submit FOI requests relating to the handling of this crisis. Is it true that these requests have not been met?
I'm sorry, I'm not aware.
You're not aware of any FOI requests?
No, I'm aware of FOI requests. I'm not aware of an outstanding FOI request.
So you've actually given the information that has been requested, have you?
I'm sorry, I didn't say that. I was say I'm not aware of any outstanding ones. I can certainly check and come back to the committee.
So when you say not outstanding, basically you've refused to supply the information?
We can't refuse to supply FOI information. We're required to supply information, just as we're required to meet our obligations if people have a subject access request, which we've also had a number of requests for, and we provided that information to people. If there are outstanding FOI requests that you're aware of, if you give them to me, of course, I'll follow up and check that that's been done.
What I'd like to do, Lord Hall, if it's okay, I'd like, please, if you could do just a write to the committee, would that be okay? Just in terms of the current situation is with FOI requests.
Certainly.
Because I'm hearing quite a different thing from BBC employees that effectively FOI requests are either being ignored or are being responded to in the negative because they're saying about non-disclosure of personal information is being used as an excuse and data protection.
Very happy to follow up on that.
Thank you. Just finally, are there any approaches from any sort of large-scale law firms acting on behalf of people in order basically to looking to represent groups of women impacted by this the unequal play?
We haven't had a group of women being represented in that way in relation to equal pay. What we do have is a small number of law firms representing a number of individuals.
So it's just individual firms, no sort of group action?
We haven't had a group action, but we do
you
have
anticipate getting a group action?
We very much hope not, because it remains our view that we want to resolve these issues informally. Where there are issues we want that we find, we will deal with them. What we do have is a small number of law firms representing a number of women.
But you probably agree that disclosing information and responding to FOI requests would reduce the chances of potential down the line ending up with large-scale law firms coming in group action, which would cost the BBC and ultimately we licence fee payers a lot of money.
We've been very clear from the outset. We've encouraged people to come forward, that we've sought to resolve issues informally. We've put mechanics in place to investigate cases thoroughly and with assurance. If there are still problems with process for individuals and they bring them to our attention, we'll deal with that.
Finally, have you made any sort of estimate of exactly how much this is going to cost the BBC?
We, of course, had to make estimates at different stages. Until we reach the end of the process, we're not in a position to talk about the total cost of equal pay claims, but the number of equal pay claims remains small from the overall number of questions that are raised.
Thank you, Chair.
Paul Farrelly.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick couple of supplementary questions on this. I was talking to a lady, the BBC recently, whom I've known for years, who's one of the people who's not happy with the situation. And I detected a particular unhappiness about the way the informal process was working from the outset, that may lead people to go down the more formal grievance route, which they don't really want to do because it's upsetting and confrontational. And I was told that people, when they want to lodge a complaint, or however you want to call it, they're given an email inbox with no named person. They find it difficult to get face-to-face, and the whole design of the process from the outset leads some people to wonder what the HR director of the BBC has paid a £310,000 a year for.
I think the email inbox is the way that the process works is that people email into the inbox. They can also raise issues through their local HR person or through their manager. Sometimes, of course, people don't want to raise through their manager for all the reasons we've been talking about. And then what should happen is then there's a reach out to them on an individual basis from a person, and then the process sets off. We, at different points, have had, particularly where we've published information, about positions in cohort. A lot of people have come in at once. The speed of that getting back to individuals isn't always good enough. There's been delay for some people, which they found unacceptable, and that's taken them, got them to the conclusion that they need to go through to grievance in order to, if you like, get attention to their case. It's not what we want. We keep the door open. We try to improve in communication all the time. And at any point, if we can find a way of resolving informally, whatever stage people are at, we'll seek to do that. We've made a good deal of progress over the summer. I think we're better at reaching out and getting to people. But if the criticism is that it's not, that all the processes don't go through quickly enough and that communication isn't good enough, that's criticism I've also heard myself. And as I've said, we're putting more resource into it all the time so that people have that one-on-one contact early.
So why can't, from the outset, if they don't want to complain to line managers or feel uncomfortable about that, why can't they go to a named person at the end of an email?
They can go to a named person. They can go to their HR director. We could put a name at the end of the helpline and email that's there, but it is going in to a team who are then triaging.
Why don't you do that from the outset? Put a name on it.
We have very, very many people coming through and raising queries. The idea that there is a barrier to asking these questions, it doesn't feel true to our experience. Getting that right once people have raised it and getting the good kind of confidence in the process hasn't worked well in every case, and we're doing our best to rectify that.
Okay, Chair.
Giles Watling.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to move on to one of the things that attracts more interest in the media than pretty much anything else is with regard to gender and equality in pay. And that is the celebrity pay. It's an interesting one, and it keeps coming up with the likes of Chris Evans, Hugh Edwards, whatever. How does the BBC quantify or measure what they pay their celebrity, their stars? Because there's the value of celebrity, of course, and then it has to be sort of more than just mere competence. For instance, there's at the Women's Equality Party recently, Sandy Toksvig revealed that she was being paid some 40% of what Stephen Fry received for the same job as the host of QI. Now, I understand that the argument could be that Stephen Fry is a national treasure, but the argument then is that Sandy Toksvig is a national treasure. How does the BBC come up with that sort of answer?
Well, in the case of Sandy Toksvig, who is, I have to say, does a fantastic job on QI, of course, she's employed by an independent, and of course, we discuss with the indie, the makeup of all their costs, but in the end, it's for them to judge what is the right amount to pay to Sandy. But I think one factor here is the fact that the world has kind of changed, and when Stephen Fry was presenting QI at the very beginning, I think the amount that was generally deemed okay to pay presenters was much higher than it is now. As I say, the world has changed. I mean, we've taken the top talent bill for the BBC down by a quarter in the past 5 years, and that does mean that people generally are getting paid a lot less than they would have been. So that's one point. The second thing is, I think one of the things we've been working on, and Anne has been taking lead on this, it's not been easy, but I think it's right, is putting a framework on how we pay our top presenters. I'm going to avoid the use of the word talent because everybody is talented, but what we pay our top presenters, and getting rationality and a proper code for people to understand why one job is worth more than another job. We're not quite through that yet, but we're getting there. And I think rather like with the career path framework for the staff broadly, having that sort of framework in news and news-related programmes is very important.
Lord Hall, can I just ask on that, are you not in danger then, if you have a framework like that, in danger of then restricting your ability to attract the top talent, I'm going to use the word, to the BBC when you're in competition with others across the spectrum?
Well, look, I think we have to recognise, Mr. Watling, that we're not going to attract people at the kind of mega sums that others in the commercial sphere might be able to pay. I think we have to recognise that, and therefore we've got to say, look, and we've been through these discussions a lot before. You know, look, we're going to find the next generation of talent. We're going to promote people who are new to our airways and keep constantly refreshing in that sort of way. And also attract people because of the sort of work that we do. And a lot of presenters that I know could make, you know, possibly more money outside, but actually are not doing it for that. They're doing it because they are committed to the BBC. It could be to Radio 4, could be to Radio 3, and admire them hugely for that. But of course, we will lose some people, and indeed have lost a couple of people, for a large number of reasons, but no doubt disclosure and the fact that people know their pay has been a significant factor in some of those losses.
Is it not the case, though, that perhaps the issue of the independent production companies that people do use to work through and to be paid through, is that not something of a side issue? It's what the BBC is prepared to pay people, isn't it? Is it surely not?
Well, we pay a sum for a programme to an independent company. They are completely independent. What they pay on, you know, casting, what they might pay on sets, what they might pay on all the things that go to it, is up to them. I mean, they're an independent company. Of course, we talk about policies with them, but in the end, it's their judgment, and it must be their judgment. I mean, you know, they're independent companies. Thank you.
Well, Paul, can I just ask on just regard to pay for on-screen talent, I suppose is the word. I mean, there was obviously there's been a lot of focus on BBC Pay, but on the question of equal pay, there was equally, you know, a focus on the amount of money that Left Bank paid the two lead actors in The Crown, and that they paid Matt Smith more than they paid the Queen, and that was corrected. Now, they were under no public obligation to do that, but I think it was once the light, you know, the light of transparency shone on what they were paying their stars, you could see it wasn't right. Do you think, in terms of the BBC honouring its values as a broadcaster, that it should be saying to the independent production companies that it contracts with that they expect a fair pay policy for their talent?
That's right, and we do say that to them. But again, I'm just making the point, not to escape the issue, that responsibility does lie then with those companies. But we do expect them to pursue a fair pay policy, yes.
You alluded to the fact that there are a couple of people have left the BBC over pay. I mean, are you saying in the case of people like Chris Evans and Eddie Mayer that you are unable to meet their pay demands, and therefore they've left the organisation?
Well, they left the organisations for a number of reasons, and let me also say, in the case of Eddie, who I think did a remarkable job with PM, and it's an astonishingly creative presenter, and with Chris, who's done an incredible job for us, and it continues to do, because it continues up to Christmas on Radio 2, making it the most listened to show across Europe. Again, an extraordinary figure. But you know, you really need to ask them. But there's undoubtedly, knowing what's been going on, that disclosure has been a factor in their decision to leave. But you know, I listened to Chris. I know Chris because I think he's been doing so many good things in not just the programme but the charitable work he does. I listened to him at 8:07, I think it was, on Radio 2 last week, and Chris is one of those people who, as he's described, I've climbed this mountain. I want another mountain to climb, and that's I'm leaving. That's why I'm leaving, and of course, that's why he's leaving. But I don't think there's any doubt. Disclosure has made it harder for us to retain people like that. But you know, we've decided to go down that path, and we will stick with it.
But surely disclosure only makes it harder to retain people like that, as you put it, if you don't feel you can justify paying those salaries. I mean, there's nothing. Disclosure doesn't in and of itself prevent you paying higher salaries to top entertainers, but it may be that you feel that that's not justifiable.
Well, it is. I have no complaint about arguing with, or rather for, what we pay our talent, and disclosure in that sense is a good thing. What it does do is puts, in the case of, for example, Chris Evans, is me saying it, not him. I think the pressure on him when it came to the annual disclosures was quite hard. You know, for 3 or 4 days he was the centre of a lot of attention, and I think that's, if you're a presenter, that's something you've got to bear into consideration when you think about where you want to work in the future. And I take my hat off to him. I think he has been through that with an extraordinary amount of gusto. And I think he's a remarkable presenter. I love 500 Words. I love listening to him in the morning. And he's a loss to the BBC. You know, be clear, he's a loss. And he's a loss to our audiences who, when we poll them and ask them, do want us to make sure that we've got the people that they want on the radio and on the TV.
When you gave evidence to the committee earlier in the year on equal pay, and indeed in some of your public remarks on this subject as well, I mean, you talked about the fact it's not just a question of raising up women's pay to the appropriate level if they've been underpaid, but also looking across the organisation at how much some men get paid, and some of those men probably being paid less. I mean, it's what we're seeing now, the delivery of this strategy, which is that for many reasons there are a number of very senior men at the BBC, very senior broadcasters who are on high salaries, as a consequence both of their talent but also of their length of service, and probably in the future you won't see people being paid at quite that level again, and some of those people are now choosing to leave.
I think that's right. I think in this annual report and accounts you see the number of men paid over £500,000 a year coming down from 5 to 3. Of course the next year that'll be lower. And you've seen a number of women who are paid more than £200,000 going up from 7 to 14. So there is a rebalancing going on, which I think is absolutely right and proper. But with all these things, that takes time, and you know, we want to do this, you know, giving due weight to people who have given a lot of service and who viewers and listeners like watching or listening to on the BBC.
I mean, you're right to say there are numerically more women joining the ranks of the higher earners, but most of them are at the bottom end of that scale. And that if you look at the amount of money that's paid to the BBC to its most senior people, there's still a very significant balance in favour of the senior men.
I am targeting the top 10 and the top 20 of names to get a proper gender balance there for the future. It takes time when you're dealing with contracts that are, you know, over many years to make these sort of changes, but be in no doubt, myself and the team want to get to the point when the top 20 is equally distributed between men and women. It's really important to get there, and that it's not just women in the bottom and the men at the top.
Just finally on this, for me, I mean, can you see as well that I think this also this question about what on-screen talent are paid is going to recur as a theme, because particularly when we're dealing with repeat BBC series that have been commissioned out or made by BBC Studios, where the amount of money the presenters get paid will now not be disclosed, and I think the sensitivity around equal pay is such that there will be continued pressure for there to be disclosure of, you know, of what the core presenters for some of these repeat, you know, what many people would see as BBC programmes, even though they're not made by the BBC.
Yeah, I understand your point really, really clearly, and I understand, you know, why you feel very strongly about it. Equally, I want BBC Studios to succeed. I think they've had a remarkable first year, but the agreement we came to with the government way back when, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, was that we would float off, as you know, into a commercial subsidiary, in-house production. It would then be treated exactly as an independent television production company would be outside. So all I ask for BBC Studios is that it is treated equally, and it's not having to compete in a way which other independent companies would not be treated. I'm sorry, I put that rather badly. What I mean is it's treated equally to other independent companies.
I think it's not just about it's not just about the BBC Studios, but I think other companies you can track with as well. And, you know, some might say, well, you know, if you're spending 2/3 of the budget of BBC Parliament on the presenter of Question Time, you know, is that a good balance?
Well, there are the marchlands between what is public service and what is commercial, and you know, we can look at that. But if you were to say, you're not, but if you were to say, an independent company working for the BBC should disclose all the pay of its staff and its talent because it's working for the BBC, then I think that would really make us extremely uncompetitive in a place that people would not want to bring their ideas to, one, and two, that's quite a fundamental change in the way that an independent company would work, and I think that would be very difficult for them, not to say impossible.
Ian Lucas.
Can I just actually pursue just that line? So thank you very much, Damien, for introducing it about independent production companies. The BBC, as far as the using license fee payers' money is concerned, is using public money. And you said earlier about it being important, I think, for independent production companies to pay fairly. Don't you think it's an obligation on the BBC to make sure that there is equal pay when public money is used to procure contracts with independent production companies?
Yes, I think it's important that we ensure that those companies have equal pay policies, that they have policies on representation at BAME, health and safety policies, all those sort of things. But there's a difference between us ensuring that and asking them to disclose data about their staff, about their turnover, about their individual lines of business, because they are independent companies. You know, they're commercial companies. And what I don't want to do is to start commercial companies thinking because of the amount of disclosure we have. I mean, this is not happening because that's not the agreement. But, you know, that would be a great a disincentive for them to come with their best ideas to the BBC.
But those companies are benefiting from public money via the BBC. Isn't it right that we should be using that public money to pursue policies on equal pay that we want to see in our society?
And I'm saying that yes, we must ensure that they are abiding by policies that we would all agree are right by the law, if not even more than that. But that's another step to say they should then do what we have to do willingly, which is disclose pay by bands and what you're paying people. Because I think if you make a difference between an independent television company, for example, working for ITV or working for us, there'll be a disincentive to work for us. People will take their ideas elsewhere, and I don't think that would be right for our licence fee payers.
Can I turn to personal service companies? Mm-hmm. And Lord Hall, you talked earlier about people who have given a lot of service to the BBC, and it strikes me that when you give your evidence to us, you very often do pay tribute to those individuals and to people who work for the company, and you do that on a very regular basis. I'm concerned that with personal service companies, it appears from correspondence that the committee have had with the BBC that the decision to move to that model was not considered by the board. Now, is that your understanding too?
Yeah, so Anne and I can only speak for what's happened since 2013 when we took over and have had to deal with what is a historical programme. The NAO are looking and intend to report sometime later in this autumn about the origins of this issue, which is before our time. And I think it's fair to say that minutes and other things of that time, it's very difficult to understand quite what was decided when and by whom. And I don't think we can find records of the boards, or the then way the place was governed, having taken decisions about it. So, but that's a historical issue.
I understand it's a historical issue. I understand that it's a historical issue, but it's also affecting individuals who are now working for the BBC. Mm-hmm. So it's a current issue as well. What concerns me here is that a decision that had a big impact on those people who have given a lot of service to the BBC was not considered by the board. Now, is that your understanding, that the decision was not considered by the board?
What I can say, Mr. Lucas, is that the issues of PSCs is one that since Anne and I have been at the BBC has been discussed at length at the Executive Board and the Trust, and again at the board since then. And what we've been dealing with, I think, are two issues in our time in the BBC. One is around 2017 and the consequences of the changes implemented then by HMRC. We knew changes were coming, but we thought there were limited changes for some individuals in television and news. What we didn't know was that HMRC were going to overturn what was then an agreed test in the radio industry and suddenly start examining and put a new test in for 3,000 plus people, individuals, who were working in radio. So that was number one. That happened very, very rapidly, and that's what we're dealing with in 2017. And the second issue we've been dealing with...
So was that considered by the board?
That was considered by the board, yes, absolutely. And the current arrangements of our governance have been through this rigorously. They're reported on, I would say every month, but almost every month, and have taken detailed papers on all of this. Because the consequences of HMRC suddenly deciding to, as it were, overturn the radio industry's guidelines, which had been the way that whether you'd go in a PSC or not had been decided beforehand, was something we hadn't expected and was done very, very rapidly. And that's a lot of what we were dealing with in the last year. Plus, the other point is the consequences of HMRC wanting to look retrospectively, going back for some individuals as well, which is why we decided, and again, this has been to the board, and we've spent some time debating this, decided to go to HMRC and have conversations about whether we can look to come to an arrangement with them to deal with the cases of these individuals in a bulk sense, so that we're not spending, and individuals, some of them who are in difficult circumstances, are not spending time going to tribunals, etc., in the coming years. Those conversations are going on at the moment. I think we have conversations with HMRC sometime later this month. And I think they're behaving constructively. We're trying to behave constructively to try to get this issue, which is a historic issue, which we're trying to deal with, solved.
I think the concern that I have, and it's come through as a bit of a theme in the hearing today, is that you seem to be relying on individuals who work for you, whether they be employees or whether they're self-employed, to be coming to you with issues. And I have concerns about your governance structure, about dealing with these issues proactively. Because, I mean, we heard from Liz Kershaw in evidence to this committee about the impact that as an individual, for her, the BBC's decision on personal service companies had. And I've heard from individuals in private about the big impact that this has had. And I think that it doesn't seem to me that within the organisation as a whole that the governance structure at the minute is responding adequately to the concerns of the people who are giving a lot to the organisation.
I'm sorry you feel like that, or that people might think that. As with gender pay, we have been, and gender balance in the corporation, this is something that we've been at for a much longer time than you might believe if you just look at what's happened over the last year. PSCs has been an issue we've been constantly on. When the HMRC changed the radio industry guidelines last year, again, we were very proactive in getting on top of this issue. I think what I would say is I don't think any of us expected them to include radio people who had the radio industry guidelines, had been covered by that. And that was 3,000 people, a lot of whom was, as you heard from some colleagues in March, are in local radio, not on high incomes. We have been really, really solid on ensuring that those people, Anne can describe, have had support. We've been proactive in that. Could we do more? I always think you could do more, but I don't think we've been just sitting back and waiting for things to happen. We've known this was an issue, and we wanted to deal with it, which is why actually we decided, nobody else decided, that we wanted to go to HMRC and whether we can get the retrospective issues of this sorted.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could I just ask on this point, if it is proven to be the case that there were either BBC employees or BBC freelancers that were told they had to set up a personal service company, and that as a consequence of that decision, if that advice proves to have been incorrect, and if that person has lost out as a consequence of that, will the BBC look to compensate people where the BBC clearly has, I think, a degree of culpability for that person being required to set up a personal service company in order to be paid?
In many cases, we're talking about decisions which were taken a very long time ago, and everybody's circumstances are different, and there are sort of two steps. One is people moving from roles that have been staff roles into freelance activity, or indeed joining the BBC as a freelancer from somewhere else. And then the second stage of the BBC contracting those people, freelancers, through PSCs. What we said that we would do is where people faced tax liabilities in the past, we would look at that case by case individually. And that's still open to us, but what Tony has described is in terms of this jeopardy which people are either facing retrospectively or are worried that they're going to face retrospectively, our objective is to try to resolve that with HMRC so that we can then deal with it in that way. It's very complex. Everybody's circumstances are different, and many of the problems that we're dealing with people having their employment status change going forwards under the application of the new zest. There are lots of challenges around getting their contracts straight, making expenses policies straight, looking at the fee frameworks, making sure those are right. And we've made good progress on that. We have fortnightly meetings with a group of people representing staff in that, representing people in that area, alongside the trade unions. All of that, we can make good progress resolving. But while people are concerned that a change in employment status going forward opens them up to jeopardy in the past, and these questions that you raise, particularly for individuals in PSCs, it's very, very challenging and difficult and stressful for those individuals. So our objective is to try to resolve that with HMRC so that we can deal with it in one go, rather than people having to go to tribunal, establish a liability, then come to us and go through a long process to establish who's, to use your phrase, culpable for what. Because that we may need to do that, but I very much hope that we don't.
I just want to try and simplify this a little bit, because it seems to me that there are individuals that approached this committee and was the basis of evidence we took earlier in the year, who were freelancers. Liz Kershaw's an example of this, who were told they had to set up a personal service company and went months without being paid because they were reluctant to do that. There are other individuals who were on staff contracts who were told to set up personal service companies as well, who didn't want to do it. Now, if a consequence of those decisions, where it's clear that the BBC required that this be done, and if it transpires that, as a consequence of that decision taken against the wishes of either the freelancer or the employee, that they have a tax liability that the HMRC is pursuing, is whether the BBC will accept some responsibility for that. I think that's I think as a point of principle, I think it would give a lot of comfort to individuals who are genuinely very worried that they may end up with a huge tax bill they can't afford and have to sell their homes as a consequence of this, because of a decision that they never wanted to take in the first place, but they were told they had to do, otherwise they wouldn't get paid. And in a position like that, and I appreciate this may still be hypothetical, and you won't want to be drawn on individual cases, but I think to give some reassurance to people who are genuinely very frightened about what the future may hold for them as a consequence of a decision that was really taken by the BBC.
And that's why we're going to HMRC, and that's why we're pursuing discussions with them as fast as we can make HMRC talk to us about this. I think I'm concerned about this from the point of view of the people who are working for us, and I want to make sure that we can get this resolved. So I'm really hopeful that HMRC and ourselves can come to some settlement.
Just a final question from me, and I think we have a couple of final questions on the nations and regions, then we'll bring the session to a close, so that we're in our sort of final few minutes. I just wanted to go back on one thing you mentioned earlier on, Lord Hall, about the BBC not wanting to be reliant on selling through platforms like Amazon and Netflix in the future as the only route to selling products, and that you felt you should be working with other similar broadcasters to do that. I mean, I know we've talked about this in the past, but for you, is that looking at the BBC along with other UK broadcasters developing their own platform to sell content on demand to the public?
So I think the future of the BBC is a balance of keeping our linear channels working really well. And I have to say, Charlotte Moore and the team are doing brilliantly at that, and the awards are winning. And one of the things I do take pleasure from this annual report and accounts, there's lots and lots of things we've got to get right and work on, and it's right we concentrate on these things, is creatively it was a very, very strong year. So that's on the linear side. On the non-linear side, digital side, I think, and I know what we have to do is to build iPlayer, That's fantastically important. Getting the user interface there is important. Using data there is important. Using AI to get you the kind of programs that we know you would like to hear or see is really, really important. The appointment of Keris Bright, who we brought in from Virgin Media to come and run as Chief Customer Officer. The word customer's in there because actually we want to get a real focus on the sense of being able to say to you as license fee payers, look at all the things you can get from us. And we're not trying to sell you anything. We're just trying to give you very good programs. So focus on iPlayer is key and growing iPlayer. What we've learned over Christmas and since then about box sets is really important. Tile size, all of those things really important. Relaunching Sounds next month, doing the same for radio, absolutely vital. And what I was announcing here with Anne and the team yesterday of saying we want to bring down our number of online brands to 8, iPlayer, Sounds, News and so on, really important. And I feel very confident about our future there in terms of developing our services for the license fee payers. But that's not enough. We are talking with ITV and also Channel 4 to see what else we can do together. I can't tell you more than that at the moment, but I am very content and repeat to you what I've said in public, but also here, I think, before. The more that Channel 4, ourselves, ITV, can work to conserve, for the right reasons, what I think is an amazing ecology in this country, producing great television, then we should do that. I'm really content with what we're doing with ITV outside this country. Our BritBox, which is a joint venture between ourselves and ITV, our content in the States is growing very well. Subscriber numbers are going up as well. I can't speak for Canon McCall, but we were talking about expanding that beyond North America to other territories as well. So outside the UK, we are working together, and I want us to do more. Inside the UK, I think there are things we can do too.
So inside the UK, so could that mean, for example, that you could see a BritBox type service that could make programs available to viewers that aren't currently available through the iPlayer?
So the issue of what's available on iPlayer, to our mind, growing the service not in an imperial way, but just growing the service that we can offer to our license fee payers, I think is absolutely key. But that still needs, as you're suggesting, a lot of rights which are then left over. And the question is how we combine with others or sell to others to make best use of that on behalf, to get value back to the license fee payer, but also as a consumer to be able to see things which otherwise you might not be able to see.
Ian Lucas.
I wanted to ask a question about the support for local newspapers and regional journalism. What's your assessment of the initial impact of that?
We haven't yet filled all the places on that scheme. I think it's working well. I'm getting anecdotally some good feedback on stories that we are covering that we otherwise wouldn't be covering. What news must do is to assess where we are on that. I think I've said to you before, and I repeat, this is not a subsidy to local newspapers, but it is absolutely us working with local newspapers to say that there is a gap in what we can all report, and we want to do something about that in terms of local democracy, in terms of court cases and so on. So I'm optimistic about this. I am certain it's going to work, but individually I want to make sure we go through and make sure that what we're running is giving value back to the people who pay for us and not just in local newspapers. But I travel optimistic about this. I think it's really important, which is why I also made a speech last November, which the annual report accounts mentions, about the importance of local radio and us reshaping local radio, not just to, in that very BBC phrase, hold to account, but also to celebrate local communities. And I think, and to, as it were, say local radio is not just above the plus 65s, there's nothing wrong with that, but actually it's for the broader warp and weft of the community. And I really believe in local radio. I think it's a really important part of what we do. And of course the democracy reporters feeding to that as well.
I really believe in BBC local radio, Lord Hall. It's just a shame that we don't have it in Wales.
I hope what we're doing in I just mentioned Wrexham with putting a new correspondent in there, getting our FM coverage improved. I know from Rodri, I know myself, that you're a fearsome fighter for that part of Wales, and it's good that you do, because it actually reminds us how you can't just in Wales concentrate on what happens on the M4 corridor down south.
And just a little bit of comfort to my good colleague Julie, as a North Wales MP who rarely appears live on Sundays on Wales TV coverage, so don't worry too much about that.
Just to show there's no north-south bias there, it's the same in Kent too. Paul Farrelly.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the local democracy reporter scheme, or the local news partnership. I found reference to it on 145 journalists on page 50, but I can't find any reference on pages 194 and 196 of how much it's costing you. How much you're spending on it.
The figure, I think, but let me check this off the top of my head, is around about £7 million, but I can come back to you with the exact figure.
If you could, I think what would be quite useful for us, if you could come back to us on the costs.
Of course I can.
And also some more details of how it's working, which organisations the journalists are with and where they are, so then we can just get an idea about how balanced it is between organisations and across the country, and if there are areas where there are gaps where organisations need a prod to try and avail themselves of the benefits of it. That would be useful information too.
Mr. Farrelly, maybe I could hold that until the point at which we've done our own review about how this is working, and then submit that as a paper or something like that. Because
how long would that take?
I don't know. I can give you the actual budget figure very, very quickly. But I do want us to assess properly how this is working. I think it's really important, and I, like you, want to make sure this works for the common good. But
no, I think I'm very happy for that, because I think it's £7 million is £7 million. It's 5 times or 4 times as much you spend on the Parliament channel, for instance, and I think you yourselves and everybody else will want to know to what extent it's adding something extra. Rather than just either substituting or taking the place of what local newspapers used to do as their bread and butter.
Yeah. Well, that's precisely the point I think is really important, which is this is not a subsidy. This is actually us doing something which otherwise would not happen, and we all kind of benefit. And let me just say the figure I came up with is what I kind of recall from way back, where the back of my head somewhere. It may be a number of years put together, but I will come back with that figure.
It is a period.
Thank you very much.
It's a period figure, is it? Yeah.
Quick question, Charles? Then we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, okay, very quick question. We haven't touched on it before. I just wanted to know, mentioning figures, the 1.2 billion that the commercial subsidiaries of the BBC in revenue generated last year, and the rules changed, I believe, in April last year. And I just wonder how you're planning to expand that and use those revenues.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an ecology, as you know, that both I can have a top-line dividend comes back to the BBC, but also programme investment comes back to the BBC. Bringing studios and worldwide together into one company, I think, is really beneficial. We've started looking, or rather the company is looking, but with me and Anne, looking at how genre by genre we can build our output, not just for the BBC, but for others. We've got an ambitious strategy in something which I think is a core BBC strength, which is natural history. We're being very ambitious, likewise, in science. Again, I think that's a real strength for us. It's interesting that our first programme for Channel 4 came from our science team. It was about the fatberg. It's come from our science team within studios. But we're looking to grow, and this will take some time. But I really believe that in the specialist strengths that we have in studios, there are things where we can do programme making which will make us world leaders around the world, and that's our ambition.
All right. Thank you. That's all right. Thank you.
Lord Hall and Bulford, thank you very much for your evidence this morning. That concludes the committee's questions. Thank you. No, not at all. No, well, thank you very much for sort of bravely carrying on. I'm glad the Prime Minister lent you some of her sweets.